It's time for EdTech Mondays, brought to you by MasterCard Foundation and CC Hub.
Welcome to another episode of EdTech Mondays Nigeria, a platform that facilitates critical conversation on the use of technology for teaching and learning. I am Chinyolu Akpa, your host on the show, and it's good to be back here again. This week, we'll be continuing our conversation on strengthening Nigeria's EdTech ecosystem through sustainable public-private partnerships. And joining me on the show to continue the conversation graciously from last week are our two guests who did justice to this introduction, Dr. Olusoji and Joshua from New Globe and MTN, who gave us beautiful insights, varying perspectives on what PPPs mean for EdTech in Nigeria. Specifically this episode and this week, we will examine the policy and the regulatory landscape and how private innovators and governments can collaborate more effectively. And this conversation is very important because we know that for the government, a lot of things are bound by legislature. In fact, everything is bound by legislature. And if it's not within the ambit of legislature for government, they are limited on what they can do. And most times, as I would advise, organizations who are seeking to partner with the government, is go look for what already exists and see how you can build on it. Go look for problems that the government have identified as things that are problems to them and figure out how you can solve problems. I remember from last week, Joshua, you mentioned that these partnerships have to be mutually beneficial. Yes. So even when you think about the private sector players, it's how do we look for that mutually beneficial scenario that plays out for the stakeholders involved in the conversation. So I'll start my conversation this morning by asking you, Dr. Akin Olusoji, what are the best or most suggested policy actions that can enable the delivery of effective EdTech programs in Nigeria? And to answer this, you might want to consider if there are any policy gaps that exist. I do not think that we have policy gaps. I think we will have too many policies. But do you think there are policy gaps that exist that hinder public-private sector partnerships for EdTech growth in Nigeria? And how do we then begin to make it look good to get these partnerships on board?
Well, thank you very much for having us again. I speak for my colleague here as well. When it comes to policy, so the way to understand, and just for the benefit of everyone, is yes, there's the legislation, and the empowering law. Mm-hmm. There's the policy that can be extracted out of that. Mm-hmm. But then there's a useful thing that we call guidelines, which usually are the flexible areas where the implementing agency, if you like, is able to play around in terms of its interpretation of the law or of the policy that is now implementing. So when it comes to EdTech and enabling environment for EdTech, first and foremost is that I think it doesn't get better than CAMA in the Company and Island Matters Act, in the sense that now we have a business document or a business law that allows even this kind of play, to happen in our country, Nigeria. The Startup Act itself also, empowers people to be able to, get up and go, bootstrap. And before now, we didn't have things like this. So those are very good things. Also in the Ministry of Information Technology, we see a lot of things that the Honorable Minister is putting out there, which may not be yet legislation, but are policy from the ministry and therefore guidelines. So around digital infrastructure, trying to get connectivity across the country, in terms of, even into the most remote areas, because all these things are enablers to EdTech services or EdTech solutions. Ordinarily that if you travel to anywhere in Nigeria, the state capital looks so beautiful and all of that. But what happens in the rural area? And that is where the EdTech needs to reach. Exactly. Actually, because that's where the exclusion, happens. The so-called, all the out-of-school children issues that we have are in those remote areas. Of course, they're in urban as well. But that's the real target is to get there. And while it may not be business efficient, if you like, or business, valuable to just go there directly, having an enabling policy that makes either, softens, the business conditions in terms of the cost of, cost of entry or cost of implementation in those places would definitely be useful. So clearly, digital infrastructure across the country will be something, worth seeing. Policies around funding, education intervention funds that are accessible, without, a million checklists,
And hurdles to jump.
to go through, or even just making those hurdles known. Because
Okay.
sometimes,
Absolutely, I agree with
publicly available, so that people actually know what it takes to get ABC funding or XYZ funding from the government at, single-digit interest rates and things like that. It's those kind of policies that we now need, because really, it's not for want of, EdTech solutions. You were telling us the other day about, the fellowship that you support, and there were about 300, or more,
Applications.
applications. So the average Nigerian is ingenious, by birth. There's no, and so, the entrepreneurial spirit is there, the ability to see a problem and want to solve it is there. But there are enablers, in this case, policy, that need to be there. So I think really the enablers are around infrastructure, supply, hard infrastructure, digital infrastructure and things like that. And then also funding, which are usually the two main areas where you see a lot of startups, struggling in order to, that initial capital to get up and go. The financial services system, cannot, just by the nature of the economy, cannot go below a particular commercial cost, and we all know what the inflation numbers and things like that are saying. So there has to be another, almost like a surgical bypass. In this case, the government coming in to soften the funding landscape for EdTech, for education. If truly education is a national objective, then we need to put our money, put the money where our mouth is.
Thank you, Dr. Akin. You have done good. And
Just good.
yeah, very good. And I like how you have drawn out things that people in the education business wouldn't think as of any interest to them. As you just mentioned, CAMA, right? The Competence and Allied Matters Act. Someone in education will not sit down and think it's really, pertaining to that. And that's what I say about knowing what already exists. And even before looking for these partnerships, doing your homework. Then when you do your homework, and I don't know if, when you think about education and people who try to get into education, they actually understand the business side of things and trying to look for everything possible to see how they can unlock access, partnerships, information, as you mentioned last week, Joshua, that gets them into whatever areas or partnerships they want to get at the end of this. So thank you very much, Dr. Olusoji, for that. And coming to you, Joshua, coming from your perspective in telecoms and digital platforms, what is the role of your regulators, the NCCs of this world and the NITDAs of this world, in shaping and enabling PPPs that would accelerate digital learning and education access? I asked this because I remember listening to something, I don't know what big player now, industry player, that said our laws sometimes are very draconian, right? These things that these regulatory bodies put are very draconian. That's one. And again, beyond it being draconian, I think it was the MD or the owner of Stanbic IBTC, I can't remember now. He was saying that a same rule that applies in business can be a slap on the wrist for one player in an ecosystem and can lock up and shut down a particular business for another player. So it's not an exactly level playing field when it comes to regulations. So from your standpoint, how easy are your regulators making it for these partnerships? How are they shaping and enabling PPPs that accelerate digital learning in Nigeria?
Thank you very much, and pleasure to be here again.
Thank you.
If I look at it from the top, right, and I want to piggyback on what Dr. had said, there was a time where there was a shortage of Nigerians transacting, businesses and all of those, and then there was that rave about financial inclusion, right? As we were talking, an idea just sprung on my head that can we have education inclusion, right? Putting the same emphasis, it's something like that that sprung on my head, right? We could have an education inclusion policy, of course, being backed by all relevant stakeholders or agencies. I'm talking about NIDA, NCC, even the Ministry of Education, UBEC, and all these guys. But particularly from the telco regulation point of view, I think over the years, they've been very supportive, extremely supportive, towards ensuring that nobody's left behind. But more can be done, of course. Like we've said previously, telco provides access, right? We provide access to even the nooks and crannies of the nation. You're able to pick your phone today and call someone, in the farthest part of Nigeria, for instance. That is already access, right? So talking about education inclusion, can we then maybe provide policy directions that can enable, and we've talked about different things, right, that can enable education get to this part of the world. If we take education inclusion as something serious, as a serious business, such that we are thinking about everyone not being left behind, and also having at the back of our mind that we still have about 20 million people or 20 million children out of school. If this is what is at the back of our mind and also at the forefront of this policy, I think that we'll continue to see areas of partnerships, also from a public point of view and also from a private point of view, to see how to tackle this menace. 20 million children out of school is not a joke, right? These are people that we expect in a couple of years, they should be able to start thinking on their feet. But if they're already out of school, they're already challenged, right? So from the telco regulation point of view, they can continue to support, right? See how to, for instance, like Doctor said, the right of way for broadband penetration is also part of the
ways they can
the
support.
ways they
Yeah.
can support, right? Maybe also, like I said last week, making maybe data affordable for education. Of course, we are also providing, data for even educationists, people who need data, to say, okay, in terms of maybe education in this area of the nation, are people even engaging with education content, for instance, right? What's the level of people that are engaging with this content? What are the things, that we can do? What are the content that people are even looking for? What form of content that people engage with? Is it just audio? Is it audio visual? Or is it, maybe just visuals? So these are the things that I think that they can continue to do to support, so that we can have everyone not left behind and have a very well and improved community.
Great, thank you. I think it's always very easy to recommend
Yeah.
coming up with policies. I think that's what most people would always want to say, but is there a role that evidence has to play in driving this partnership? So think about, if we're trying to broker something with the NCC and it's not an EdTech organization trying to broker now, it is your telco trying to broker. Would evidence or data in any way make this easy? I think sometimes the taste of, the pudding is in the eating. How do you convince? And convincing at this point is evidence. And I know that there's a big problem with data sharing and, putting out what is. Because sometimes it might not even be what you have that could get you the partnerships, but showing what someone else has done and saying that my solution is also modeled, or similar to what this big player as well has. But this big player might not be willing to share or provide that evidence that this has worked.
I think evidence clearly is what has, helped us. One of the major success factors, for what we do as New Globe. As you know, we're in about 5 state governments in Nigeria supporting their public primary schools. But we also, outside Nigeria, support the national governments, Liberia. We've supported national government of Rwanda, and a few others in their, public education systems as well as technical partners. We're also signed up with the Nigeria Governors Forum, as their educational technical partner, where we show them, again, evidence of what is going on in, for instance, the support we had in the Edo Best program that also got World Bank assistance, in the Co-Excel program in Lagos, in the Kwara Learn program in Kwara, and in Bayelsa, the Bayelsa program, and very recently signed up with Jigawa State, in the Jigawa Unite program. Those programs did not all start at once. It was one, and then the next, and then the next, and that was on the basis of the evidence in Edo Best. A Co-Excel came up. The evidence in a Co-Excel, Kwara Learn came up. The evidence in Kwara, Bayelsa. So evidence has a very strong place to play, in the sense that when you see that children in a particular state, and states can be quite competitive when it comes to that, are learning, almost what they should have learned in 1 year, in 2 years in a traditional public teaching system. They're learning it in less than 1 year, just by making sure that the teachers, as I explained last week, are receiving scripted guides, digitized, structured pedagogy, getting it and making sure that they actually teach the content. There's monitoring, and accountability that comes, when they resume, when they left. SUBEB can, penalize or reward based on, all of that. So the evidence usually does that, because once you see the data, you see a child that could not read 5 correct words per minute before is now reading, 15, 20 and improving 30, 40, 50. You can see that and you're like, oh, wow, okay, come and do this in my state. Or, can you start with this set of schools and then, continue with the next local government and things like that. So I agree with you that definitely evidence does that. I think where, if I may attempt to speak for, a company like MTN, where the challenge comes in is you have to prove the commercial viability, on both sides. Because, MTN is also, as much as this may be a CSR or things like that, but there's even the value of, of a CSR intervention that needs to be
someone needs to bear.
That needs to bear and needs to be convincing,
Yeah.
to his principals.
Yeah.
So the ability to show the commercial viability and education is it's not easy to show that there, because they tell you the teacher's reward is in heaven. That's already like, so nothing here on earth, but no, or that the child, K to 12, that child cannot begin to take a decision for himself or herself until 18 years, so you cannot even extract, quote and unquote, is it tax, is it, whatever it is. So, business, such as the telco, it takes a lot more, to convince them. So that's where, again, policy comes in. So will it be a policy intervention? So you had the road tax credit. Do you want to have the education tax credit? You had, digital infrastructure right of way, at X price in this state, X price in that state. Do you want to standardize it? What will it take, to standardize that? Do you want to securitize a funding for education? Just tapping into my capital market background, what kind of securitized funding, or investment vehicle that can be created to be targeted at education? Or, you have the BOI. What can the BOI do? I'm sure they have education funds.
Exactly.
Are they publicly available information? Do they want to do a lot more publicity just so these EdTech startups understand that it's there? And then, of course, organizations like yourself, CC Hub, MasterCard Foundation and organizations like that. I think the word is galvanizing that ecosystem and bringing the information to them and finding ingenious ways. Let me give an example that I just thought about. The average EdTech startup will think that the only intervention funds they can target are education intervention funds. But let's assume that your EdTech was skewed towards teaching for, the creative economy. That could open access to creative, let's say your EdTech was targeting some level of financial inclusion. That could open you to a financial inclusion. So just being, a little more innovative and not, straight-jacketed, if you like, in how you're thinking about it, could actually unlock some doors.
Thank you so much, Dr. Odusoji and Joshua. So our final question, because we could keep going on this, very interesting topic. If you had one policy wish to accelerate EdTech partnerships in Nigeria today, what would it be? Again, okay, remember last week looking at me as the devil, right? This week, I'm Aladdin and you're Genie. So if you had one policy wish to drive EdTech adoption, development, advancement in Nigeria, Dr. Odusoji and Joshua, what would it be?
Well, I think for me to be around two things. One, which is something we find very difficult in this part of the world, is around implementation, right, or execution and standardization, right? Policies that can reward implementers and people that stick to standard, right? Because what we see is, like you said, we have loads of ideas, right? We have loads of ideas. I think we're now even suffering from information overload, right? And we really don't get things done, So can we start having policies that reward people that get things done, albeit in a standard way, right? And in that sense, if we begin to have people bringing the ideas to the fore, ensuring that the standards are well managed and kept and upheld, right? And then execute continuously and consistently. I think we'll all be better for it, right? So if we can have policy in that direction, that just kind of like a consequence management where, okay, if you do this, this is what you get, in return. And like I said, at the background of that is that what you're doing is just for you to go implement and then keep to the standard. I think it'll be good.
Well, it's very interesting that Joshua says that, a policy that rewards what is working. I dare say, and I have to say that what we do at New Globe is working. We've done it now in about 5 states. And perhaps a policy that standardizes or adopts, that kind of intervention, state-grown policy support, but with an EdTech angle to it, structured pedagogy, digital empowerment for the teacher, coaching and mentoring in school, within that system. And of course, a situation room and monitoring exactly what is going on in those schools and checking the learning outcomes in foundational literacy and numeracy. So adopting that across not just 5 states, but, there are 36 states and the FCT, that would definitely be, a winner for Nigeria. So I totally agree with you, Joshua. Rewarding interventions.
So that is rewarding interventions that work by
scaling, scaling them across the country.
Great.
Definitely.
And on this note, we have come to the end of another engaging episode of the EdTech Mondays Nigeria show. I would love to hear from you. If you had one recommendation to any ecosystem player on how to push public-private sector partnerships for EdTech, what would it be? So think of yourself as the group MD of that organization that you feel is blocking access. Think of yourself as the CEO or the Minister of Education, whatever. If you had one great idea to unlock EdTech partnership in Nigeria, what would it be? I'd love to hear from you. Send me an SMS or a WhatsApp via 0703 165 0809 or 0706 402 0742. I would love to hear from you, and I'll be here next week to read out what these ideas are. Remember, you can join our very active Telegram or WhatsApp communities. Simply search for EdTech Mondays Nigeria to join the conversation. I promise you it gets very engaged and animated in those communities. You want to join to know more. You could also follow this week's episode and previous episodes that have aired on Spotify. Simply search for EdTech Mondays Nigeria, or on YouTube, CC Hub Africa to rewatch and drop your comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until I come your way, same time, same station, I remain your host, Chinyelu Akpa. It's bye for now.
It's time for EdTech Mondays, brought to you by MasterCard Foundation and CC Hub.